Trade makes the world go around as it improves lives, creates jobs, supports sustainable development. But it is at crossroads today amid the re-globalization, said the World Trade Organization, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary with a large gathering of great minds on global trade. CGTN is here at the headquarters of WTO for the Public Forum 2024 to bring you the most up-to-date ideas and up-to-task discussions on trade and our shared future. Join us and find out what's on the horizon. From Geneva, I'm Tian and welcome to CGTN's special production, Trade and Our Shared Future. At the just concluded WTO Public Forum, I was honored to moderate the high-level panel with a lecture on globalization and a fireside chat later, focusing on some of the much debated and discussed issues lately: unilateral tariffs, industrial policy, and the voices of the developing economies in the WTO. I was joined by Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the WTO Director General, and Jason Furman, the Aetna Professor of Practice of Economic Policy at Harvard University. And let's listen in. Unilateral tariff. Of course, that is one that has been hearing a lot in the corridors, the discussions, or in the coffee shops of WTO. How do both of you see this phenomenon, and what does that mean particularly for an international trading system like the WTO? How can you overcome that immediate discussion?
Yeah, so there are some extremely limited specific circumstances in which it might make sense, especially around an issue like national security. But that's why it's really important to delimit those carefully, explain those transparently, and not go beyond that. If you're talking about something like across-the-board tariffs on every country in the world, the macroeconomic argument for that is nonsensical, and the amount of damage it would do to the global trading system is very, very real. So, just having limiting principles that dramatically limit this type of unilateral action. And that's the last thing. I mean, the trade negotiations to an economist are a strange thing, because some of the biggest benefits are you reducing your own tariffs, but somehow that's the concession you make in order to get the other country to do the thing that is in their own interest of reducing their tariffs. So we always look at it and are just a tiny bit.
On tariffs, unilateral action and so on, we've seen this movie before, as I've said. We have the Smoot-Hawley Act of the 1930s. We know what happened, it didn't work. And I don't think, we need to think carefully before going back to an era in which we're all raising tariffs on each other in a way that results in lose-lose situations. And thirdly, we've modeled some of this. It's leading to fragmentation when you take unilateral actions. And we've modeled this here at the WTO, so as the IMF, at the IMF, we modeled what would happen if this series of actions resulted in two trading blocks. What would happen? It would result in real loss of GDP in the longer term, global GDP loss of 5% is the number we've come up with, and that is really significant. Others have come up with even larger numbers. So I think we need to think carefully about these actions.
Related to what both of you just illustrated, in the name of national security, we also see industrial policies and other issues coming up. Once again, I know there's a very big debate also taking place here and beyond. Madam Director General, your take on that?
Well, when I was in graduate school, industrial policy was a dirty word. Well ahead of Jason, I don't know what it was when you were in graduate school. It wasn't something that developing countries were told that this was not the way to go. But look, seriously, there is no ideological bent against use of certain measures. We all know that certain types of subsidies can be useful for research and innovation. When applied in certain ways, they can be okay. I think at the WTO is just how do you apply these subsidies where we have very clear and specific rules about certain types of approaches to these policies. So we also need to be quite careful in approaching that.
If I could,
Furman,
oh
please.
yeah. Well, I think you have to distinguish on, for example, climate. If the United States is doing more subsidies, that does create challenges for the rest of the world, but if it results in other countries doing more subsidies too, and you have a large underpriced externality in the form of carbon, that's not such a terrible race to have. It's not ideal, but it's not awful. The domestic content requirements, though, are a much bigger issue. If we're going to tackle climate change, we're going to need to, and we do, import batteries, solar panel, wind, and the like, and any attempt to restrict that, I think, is a much more problematic and counterproductive form of industrial policy. So I think in some targeted cases it can work and be okay, but you have to be quite limited about it, and I think you want to be really, really, really nervous about it rather than instinctively enthusiastic, and some things will still pass the bar, but again, need those limiting principles like you need them for national security.
And I think it would be worthwhile if we had at the WTO a better agreement and understanding on which subsidies are the good subsidies and what are those limits. And the reason is because, as you said, Jason, developing countries have very little fiscal space to compete. And if we go into this kind of subsidy race, they'll be left further and further behind. There'll be more skepticism about whether the system really works for them. So again, it's not an ideological thing. And definitely, we feel climate change is an existential threat, and we should try to find instruments that will deliver us net zero by 2050, including through trade. But it's how, what are the limits, and how can we not leave people behind, leave members behind?
2/3, as we said, the membership of WTO are developing countries. So yet we see WTO is not being bogged down by many of the issues, for example, geopolitics beyond WTO's control. There were also myths about whether WTO will be able to implement, for example, some of the consensus earlier from the ministerial conference. Madam Director General, I personally witnessed how hard you and your colleagues work at the MC13. Tell us about what is the latest development. How can we move forward things? And Professor Furman, please also illustrate, as an economist, how and others can contribute. Please.
Talking about developing countries at the WTO is also not without controversy. Because it is the one organization where members can self-describe themselves as developed or developing, which is an unusual thing that we found. So I just want to make that clear. But that being said, I think that you asked about MC13. I think there were several successes at MC13. There were not as many. We had a success, for instance, for least developed countries, the poorest of our members, that we're quite proud of. And I want to thank members for their ability to come together in a consensus-based organization to support a transition period for the least developed countries to still enjoy the benefits enjoy certain benefits after they graduate from the least developed country status, simply because giving them a period of time to make sure they don't slip back into that category is very important.
Thank you for clarifying that, Madam Director General. As Jason said, probably the world is watching this lecture, opening lecture. Thank you so much, Professor.
Yeah, so in my remarks, I said something about inequality in the United States, that there could be some truth to trade contributing to it, but the trade restrictions can be a bad way to deal with it, and that being overly preoccupied with them can crowd out the better and more important ways to deal with it. I think there's something analogous when it comes to developing countries blaming unfairness in the global trading system, blaming the advanced economies for the fact that they haven't participated as much in the success as some other developing countries have. When they do that and left behind by the global system, there's a bit of truth to it, but there's also only so much that you can change it. And if complaining about the global system crowds out building better ports, having more transparent regulations, having better exchange rate or macro policies or whatever it is that you need to do to succeed in the global system, then those complaints are going to have a really small impact on the global system, but a large impact on your own institutions and your own policies. So you have to do this delicate balancing act of saying probably 90% of what you can do as a country is take the world system as given and maximize subject to it. And countries that have done that well have prospered, succeeded, and just done enormously, enormously well as a result. And then the other 10% recognize that no, that global system is not perfectly designed. You should have a voice. You should try to make it better, but don't let that 10% crowd out the even more important domestic policies. But don't let the conversation I just had about domestic policies suppress that voice and say you shouldn't try to make it better. You should, absolutely. It's just don't rest everything on that.
Well, I left one very important point for last because I know people are listening. One of the biggest reforms in the organization is, of course, the reform of our dispute settlement system, which we did not finish at the ministerial, but just to say that we are working on this, and we have a mandate from ministers to deliver on this. But I also want to say that it is not that the system is not working at all. There is a misconception that everything has stopped. Since we're being live streamed, I really do want those listening in the world to know that we have the panel level with 8 disputes, disputes before it at the moment. We have gotten much more creative and imaginative in the way members try to have a dialogue with each other to resolve these disputes without going through the entire system. But yes, we accept we need to reform the second tier, the appellate body. That reform is ongoing, and we hope that we'll be able to deliver on that. Now, I'll end by saying, look, we have admitted that there are those who could benefit more from globalization, and that is why we came up with this concept of reimagining globalization. How can we reimagine this to deliver more for those who have been left at the margins? And that is why we're looking at this issue of inclusiveness. So supply chains have performed really well. Jason mentioned that. But if we also want to build additional resilience, should we do it by just re-attracting those supply chains back home to our individual nations, or should we look more broadly at whether these can be situated precisely in those areas that didn't benefit, provided they have the right macroeconomic environment and the right business environment, because businesses are not charity. And we believe there are enough developing countries suitable to attract some of these resilient supply chains. Also, poor regions left behind by technology, import or trade, whatever, in rich countries can also attract these supply chains. So we're trying to reimagine how we can do globalization in a slightly different way by engaging with the business community on how they're reorganizing supply chains and encouraging them. And by the way, some of that is working. Critical minerals. Let's stop extracting from developing countries and processing elsewhere. And let's try to build the supply chains in place so that we can create jobs and bring them in and encourage trade. I leave it there.
There are a lot of work to do, obviously. So with that note, with the voices being heard from different corners of the world, thank you so much for both of you for being with us. Thank you. Appreciate it.